Rain dripped from the eaves, scattering small puddles across the worn cobblestones of the village square. She moved quickly, keeping her gaze low, careful to avoid the pointed eyes of those who whispered behind their hands. For 7 years, she had learned the rhythm of silence, of existing without being noticed, of bending yet never breaking, and of hoping, always hoping, for a glance that never came. Her hands, calloused from chores, clutched a basket of herbs. She stopped for a moment to straighten a toppled bundle, brushing rain from the delicate leaves. A child, no older than 7, reached for the basket, his small fingers trembling. "Be careful," she said softly, offering him the bundle. "You'll ruin them if you pull too hard." The boy smiled, a brief, fleeting smile that lit her chest in a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But as quickly as it came, the village elders' sharp voices cut through the air. "Watch where you wander, girl," one snapped, tone sharp and unforgiving. "Those herbs are not for your kind." Her shoulders slumped. She lowered her gaze again, shame crawling up her spine like a familiar chill. 7 years. 7 long years of invisible service. 7 long years of gentle hands ignored, of words left unspoken, of dreams left unclaimed. She had always known her place. She had always known that in this world, she existed on the edges, a shadow the Alpha King barely glanced at, a shadow everyone else mocked. And yet, she kept moving forward, small acts of kindness stitched together like fragile armor. The boy tugged her sleeve. "Thank you," he whispered. It was such a small sound, so insignificant to the world around them, yet to her, it felt like a lighthouse in a storm. A bitter wind cut across the square, lifting the skirts of her plain dress and whipping strands of hair across her face. She pressed them back, forcing herself to focus. Each day, each act, each fleeting moment of acknowledgement was a thread she clung to. A thread that reminded her she still mattered, even if no one else would say it aloud. She turned to place the herbs on the windowsill of the sick woman who relied on them, careful not to draw attention. Her movements were precise, measured, almost invisible. And for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the Alpha King, tall, imposing, his presence like storm clouds above the village. Walking past, finally noticing the grace she had carried silently all these years. But the thought was cruel, a reminder of the emptiness that trailed her wherever she went. The whispers followed her as she walked back to the edge of the village, voices slicing into her skin like cold blades. A servant girl, thinking herself important. 7 years wasted. Her stomach knotted, and she clenched her fists beneath the basket. She had long ago stopped defending herself against such words. What use was defiance when the eyes that truly mattered, the eyes that could see her, could value her, remained unmoved? A sudden shift in the air made her stop. She froze, breath caught in her chest. The Alpha King's presence had always been near, though distant, like the pull of the moon on restless tides. She had learned to sense it, to respect the distance, to never hope for more than a shadow of acknowledgement. Yet now, the hairs on her arms rose. He had appeared silently, as he always did, watching from where the stone walls met the mist. She could feel the weight of his gaze, cool yet intense, measuring her as though he were reading every secret she kept hidden, every fear she hid beneath careful smiles. Her heart quickened, not with hope, but with the sharp edge of longing she had carried too long. She did not speak, she did not move. She simply allowed herself a single heartbeat of recognition. He said nothing, offered no hand to lift her from the shadows. Yet that quiet observation was more terrifying and more exhilarating than any word could ever be. The village continued its chatter around them, oblivious, cruel in its negligence. She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Every step she took forward was weighted with the memory of 7 years of neglect, yet she carried it lightly on her back as though it were nothing more than a cloak she had grown used to wearing. A child's laughter echoed faintly in the square, bouncing between stone walls. She smiled, small and fragile, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Tomorrow, she would return to her chores. Tomorrow, she would greet another day of unnoticed labor. But tonight, she felt the faintest flicker of something she had not felt in years, a reminder that even in the coldest shadows, some warmth could still exist, even if fleeting, even if unspoken. As the Alpha King melted back into the mist, leaving her to the whispers and the rain, she allowed herself one quiet, almost imperceptible thought. Perhaps even a shadow could one day step into the light. Mist clung to the edges of the village as she moved through the narrow streets, her feet silent against the wet cobblestones. The morning had brought only grey skies and colder winds, but she welcomed them, the chill sharpening her senses, keeping her mind alert. Every step was measured, every glance downward, practiced over 7 years of careful survival. She was a shadow, just as she had always been, and yet, she was not entirely invisible. From the corner of her vision, she caught it again, a movement barely there, a presence that had long haunted her days and haunted her dreams. He stood at the edge of the square, tall and unwavering, the Alpha King's figure carved from shadow and mist. Not a word, not a gesture beyond the slow, deliberate observation of her small movements. And yet, in his silence, there was meaning, a weight she could feel pressing against her chest. She swallowed, forcing her heartbeat into a quieter rhythm. 7 years of indifference had taught her that hope could be dangerous, that longing was a fragile thing that could break against reality. And yet, the pull of his gaze was undeniable, like a storm she could not run from. He was not cruel. She had never seen cruelty in him, only distance, control, and a quiet, terrible power that demanded respect. But there was a subtle curiosity in his eyes now, a ripple beneath the stillness, and it stirred something in her she had long believed dead, the flicker of being seen. She continued her walk toward the market, each footstep carefully placed, while his presence followed, always a few paces away, blending with the mist. She dared not look directly, afraid that even a glance might betray the fragile longing in her chest. And yet, she could feel his eyes tracking her, noticing the way she straightened a fallen basket, the way her fingers lingered over the herbs she carried, the quiet patience in every movement. The villagers passed by, oblivious, muttering their cruel judgments under their breaths. She kept her head bowed, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if shielding herself from a world that had long ago learned to overlook her. But he noticed. He had always noticed. Even in the smallest gestures, he saw what no one else did, the careful strength in her hands, the gentleness in her voice, the resilience in her quiet persistence. A moment came when she paused to adjust the basket against her side, and he stepped slightly closer, almost imperceptibly, as if drawn by the weight of her small suffering. The space between them was charged, taut, yet unspoken. Neither spoke, neither moved beyond the invisible boundary that had existed for 7 long years. And yet, she felt it, the pull of him, like the first edge of a tide against her skin, inevitable and undeniable. She wanted to turn, to ask him why he watched, to demand the acknowledgement she had longed for in silence. But the words would not come. 7 years had taught her the futility of pleading for attention, for recognition, for care that might never arrive. And yet, in his quiet observation, she felt a whisper of possibility, fragile but insistent. The day passed slowly, the Alpha King never leaving her periphery. He did not intervene, did not speak, did not touch, and still, she felt the weight of his presence more keenly than any word could carry. It was a strange mixture of torment and comfort, a reminder of her insignificance and, simultaneously, a promise that perhaps, in some quiet corner of his mind, she mattered. Even the simplest interactions, accepting a gift from a merchant, helping a stumbling child, adjusting a tattered cloak on a stranger's shoulder, felt magnified under his gaze. She could not help but wonder if he saw her as she wished to be seen, tender, capable, quietly unyielding despite the weight of neglect and scorn. And somewhere beneath that wonder, deep and unacknowledged, her heart dared to hope, even if only for a moment, that his silence was not indifference, but a choice, deliberate and careful. As the sun began to sink behind the grey clouds, the Alpha King finally turned away, slipping back into the shadows from which he had come. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a yearning left unsatisfied, but also a spark, small, fragile, almost imperceptible, that whispered of attention, of recognition, of a connection she had been denied for so long. She allowed herself a single, quiet breath, letting the tension ease just enough to carry her back to the small house she called home. And in the stillness, she realized that his eyes had followed her not out of cruelty, not out of obligation, but out of something far more complicated, far more dangerous to her carefully constructed solitude, interest. The wind carried with it the faintest rustle of leaves and the subtle reminder that even in the quietest, loneliest moments, he was there. Watching. Waiting. And perhaps, somewhere in that silent observation, a thread of connection was beginning to form. A thread she would learn to hold on to, cautiously, as the world continued to overlook her in every other way. The day had begun with a thin drizzle, soft against the slate rooftops, but it grew heavier as she made her way through the marketplace. The scent of damp earth mixed with the sharp tang of herbs and smoke, and she moved through it all as quietly as possible, keeping her basket close, hoping no one would notice the tremor of her hands or the weariness in her shoulders. Her attention was on a young girl, struggling to carry a basket twice her size. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Here," she said softly, taking the heavier load into her own arms. The girl looked up, startled, eyes wide and grateful. Thank you," the child whispered, and for the briefest instant, the warmth of her smile pushed away some of the cold that had clung to her for so long. But the world was rarely kind. A merchant, hunched and scowling, jostled past, his elbow knocking her basket to the cobblestones. Herbs spilled, their vibrant greens and purples scattering across the wet stones. She knelt immediately, gathering what she could, but the merchant's voice rang sharp in the drizzle. "Careless girl. Always in the way," he snapped, his words cutting deeper than any blade. A few nearby villagers chuckled, their eyes flicking to her with the familiar disdain she had learned to expect. 7 years of service, of quiet labor, of kindness unnoticed, this was the world she inhabited. And yet, even as shame threatened to weigh her to the ground, she refused to let the tears come. A shadow fell across her shoulders. She looked up, startled, and for a heartbeat, her breath caught. The Alpha King stood there, imposing, a pillar of calm authority amidst the chaos. His gaze swept the scene once, slow and deliberate, taking in the spilled herbs, the scolding merchant, the small girl clinging to her side. And then, without a word, the merchant flinched, stepping back as though a storm had passed between them. His eyes did not soften. They were sharp, precise, a quiet force of reckoning. But when they flicked to her, there was something else, something she had not dared hope for. Recognition. Care. An unspoken acknowledgement of the injustice she had endured. She rose slowly, her hands still gathering the scattered herbs, and felt an unexpected warmth at her back, as though his presence itself had lent her strength. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to break the years of silence with even a single word, but the Alpha King did not offer words. His protection was in his stillness, in the way the merchant no longer dared raise his voice, in the way the rain seemed to fall differently around them, as if honoring a boundary only he could command. The small girl clutched her side, looking between them with wide, curious eyes. The Alpha King's attention shifted briefly to her, and though he did not speak, the weight of his gaze conveyed what words could not, that she was not invisible. That she mattered. When at last he moved, it was slow, deliberate, almost imperceptible. A step back into the misty street, a quiet withdrawal that left her standing in the rain, herbs clutched tightly to her chest. And yet, the world felt subtly altered. The scornful whispers of the villagers now seemed hollow against the gravity of his silent intervention. She could still feel it, his presence hovering just beyond her shoulder, like a shield she could not see but could sense in every nerve. She knelt once more to gather the last of the fallen herbs, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, she was more than the village's shadow. Perhaps someone, unseen by everyone else, had noticed the quiet endurance, the gentle strength, the careful way she moved through a world that had long ignored her. Her chest tightened, a mixture of hope and fear swirling together. She had survived 7 years of rejection, of being overlooked, and yet here, in the soft rain and the faint mist of morning, she felt a seed of something she had almost forgotten: trust. But the moment was fragile. A flicker of fear tugged at her heart. 7 years had taught her to guard against hope, to brace for disappointment. She could feel it in the way the villagers whispered, the way the world remained indifferent. And yet, the Alpha King's quiet watchfulness lingered in her mind, like a promise she did not dare fully believe. She rose to her feet, basket in hand, the herbs pressed close to her chest, and allowed herself a single, careful breath. Somewhere beneath the drizzle, beneath the mist, beneath the weight of years of rejection, something unspoken had begun to grow, a fragile connection, delicate yet undeniable. She did not know what it meant. She did not know where it might lead. But for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Not by the villagers, not by the world, but by him. And for now, that was enough. The evening air was cool and heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth, the village quieting as lanterns flickered one by one along the cobblestone streets. She walked slowly, her basket empty now, her hands brushing against the fabric of her dress as if to remind herself she still existed in the world. The soft murmur of distant voices and the clatter of shutters closing only amplified the emptiness she had carried for so long. Yet beneath the quiet, she could still feel it, the faint echo of his gaze from earlier, lingering like a ghost at the edge of her awareness. She had tried to dismiss it, tried to remind herself that he was untouchable, distant, a figure carved from shadow and authority. But the memory of his silent protection, the unspoken acknowledgement, had planted a seed she could no longer ignore. Her thoughts drifted unwillingly to him. The Alpha King, their worlds were separated by so much more than a glance, and yet, she found herself craving one. She wondered what it would be like to hear his voice, even in the softest whisper, to feel his hand brush hers, to know that her existence mattered to him not just in the shadows, but fully, undeniably. She shook her head, as though the movement could rid her of the dangerous yearning curling through her chest. 7 years of being unseen had taught her restraint, and yet now, the restraint felt hollow. She wanted to reach for him, to pull him from the mist where he always waited, and demand that he see her, not as a shadow, not as the girl no one cared for, but as someone alive, someone deserving, someone wanted. The village had long since gone to sleep, yet she moved as though the night itself carried the weight of her longing. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to whisper possibilities she had never dared imagine. A simple touch, a fleeting smile, a word of acknowledgement. These were treasures she had gone years without, and the thought of them made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. And then, inevitably, her mind wandered back to him. To the quiet authority that followed her through the square, to the way his presence alone could command silence, to the way he had intervened without a word when the merchant had mocked her. She could not explain the ache it left behind, nor could she fully understand why it stirred something so deep within her. She only knew that her chest tightened with a longing that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Her fingers traced the edges of the doorframe as she entered her small home, lingering on the worn wood as if grounding herself. 7 years of quiet endurance had taught her to keep her heart locked, to bury desire beneath layers of duty and survival. And yet, the thought of him, the way he had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time, made those walls tremble. She thought of every small gesture he had offered in silence, a glance that lingered too long, a shadow of attention in a world that had refused to notice her. Each one burned bright against the darkness of her solitude, igniting a fire she had convinced herself was long dead. And now, that fire refused to be denied. Her mind wrestled with the dangerous questions that followed. Could she hope for more than observation? Could someone so powerful, so untouchable, truly care for her? Was it desire, or merely curiosity, that drove him to notice her after all these years? She did not know. And the uncertainty both thrilled and terrified her. The room was still, the lanterns casting long, trembling shadows along the walls. She pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the faint rhythm of her own heartbeat, trying to steady it against the rush of emotions she could neither name nor control. Longing, hope, fear, all mingled together in a storm that refused to settle. She thought of him again, and for a moment, allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if he crossed the distance between them. Not as a shadow, not as an observer, but as something more. A protector, a companion, perhaps even a desire fulfilled, tender and reverent. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the mist curling around the village rooftops, and she allowed herself one forbidden wish. That he might see her not just as a shadow of the past, not just as the girl no one had ever claimed, but as someone worthy of attention, worthy of care, worthy of something far greater than she had ever dared hope. And in that quiet, trembling moment, she realized that her heart had begun to break free from the long years of rejection, and with that fracture came a dangerous, undeniable spark, one that could not be contained, one that refused to be silenced. Somewhere beyond the mist, somewhere beyond the distance that had always separated them, he waited. And she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that the first step toward him, and toward what her heart longed for, was a step she could no longer deny. The village had grown quieter than usual, but the stillness carried a tension that set her nerves on edge. Even the wind seemed to whisper warnings, twisting around the corners of the cobblestones and tugging at the edges of her dress. She moved cautiously, every step measured, every sound magnified in the silence that pressed against her chest. Something had shifted, an unease she could not name, yet could not ignore. She paused at the marketplace, now empty except for a few lingering traders packing their wares. Her hands trembled slightly, brushing against the folds of her basket. 7 years had taught her to anticipate danger in the small cruelties of the world. Mocking glances, sharp words, but this was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows sharper. And then she sensed it, a presence not his, yet dangerous in its intent. A rival pack, perhaps, or a courtier emboldened by jealousy. She could not see them clearly, but the feeling pressed against her skin like frost, the kind that seeped into bone. Her breath caught, and instinctively, she pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders, her pulse quickening. He appeared then, as if summoned by her awareness of peril, stepping silently from the edge of the square. The Alpha King. Calm, commanding, impossibly strong. His eyes swept the empty streets, assessing every shadow, every corner. She could feel him before she saw him, the quiet assurance of his presence wrapping around her like armor. She dared not speak, dared not move too quickly, knowing that even the slightest misstep might draw attention to her. Yet his gaze met hers for the briefest instant, and in it, she felt both warning and protection, a promise unspoken but absolute. You are mine to guard. A commotion rose from the far end of the street. A messenger, flustered and trembling, tripped as he approached the village hall, his cloak snagged on the wooden post. The papers he carried scattered across the wet stones. And in the shadows beyond the lamplight, a figure waited, hidden but intent. The Alpha King's presence shifted subtly, a silent signal that she should stay behind him. His hand hovered near the hilt of his blade, yet never grasped it. Control, always control, even in the face of threat. She felt the weight of his power pressing against the danger, an invisible barrier that rendered the would-be aggressors uncertain, hesitant. Her heart pounded. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, yet she could not tear her gaze from him. In the stillness of that moment, she realized the depth of what she had longed for in secret. This quiet, protective force, always near yet untouchable, was no longer a distant figure. He was here, present, watching over her in ways the world never would. The danger passed as quickly as it had arrived, the messenger regained his footing, the figure melted into the shadows, but the tension remained, lingering in the space between her and the Alpha King. She could feel the electricity of it, the silent communication that words could never capture. He had ensured her safety without a word, without acknowledgement, yet the message was unmistakable. He would not allow harm to touch her. She pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the thrum of her pulse, the fragile flicker of hope and fear intertwining. 7 years of rejection had left her cautious, wary of attachment, yet here, in the midst of threat and shadow, she recognized something new. She was not alone. She had never truly been alone. The Alpha King's gaze lingered on her, steady and unwavering, before he finally turned and melted back into the mist, leaving her trembling yet inexplicably calm. She allowed herself a breath, long and shivering, and felt a strange thrill course through her. Danger had passed, yes, but it had also drawn them closer in ways the world would never see. She realized then that her fear and longing were no longer separate. Danger had a way of clarifying truth, of stripping away pretense. And the truth, stark and undeniable, settled heavy in her chest. She had begun to depend on him. Not just on his protection, but on the presence of his watchful, silent care. The village seemed smaller now, more fragile, as she made her way home through the wet streets. Every shadow could conceal threat, every footstep could herald peril. But beneath that fear, beneath the memory of whispers and scorn, a seed had been planted. She could not yet name it, could not yet give it shape, but she sensed it growing, a connection to him, forged in silence, strengthened in danger, impossible to deny. By the time she reached her small home, the first stars were glimmering in the misted sky. She paused at the threshold, shivering despite her layers of cloth, and allowed herself one quiet thought, fragile as the dew on the rooftops. He had saved her. He had watched, he had protected, and though words had not passed between them, she knew that the bond had shifted. It was no longer simply observation. It was guardianship. And somewhere, deep within, a dangerous longing began to stir. one that she could not quell, one that she could no longer ignore, even as the shadows of the night whispered of threats still to come. The moon hung low over the village, silver and watchful, spilling its light across the wet cobblestones. She stepped out quietly, drawn to the edge of the woods where the mist curled like smoke around the ancient oaks. The day had been long, filled with whispers and subtle dangers, and yet here, beneath the soft glow of the moon, she felt the fragile weight of peace settle on her shoulders. She had almost convinced herself that she was alone. Almost, but not entirely. There, standing in the shadowed clearing, was the Alpha King. Tall and imposing, his presence stretched across the space like a living barrier, silent yet unmistakably commanding. He did not approach too closely, did not speak, and yet the tension between them thrummed like the soft heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. For a long moment, they simply watched each other. She could feel the pull of his gaze, steady and unwavering, like a tether she could not resist. The mist curled around them, blurring the edges of the world, and in that soft grey silence, something unspoken began to take form. She stepped a little closer, hesitant, her hands brushing the folds of her dress, tracing the familiar lines as if grounding herself. He did not move to meet her, but she felt the quiet permission in the tilt of his head, in the way his eyes softened, though only slightly. 7 years of longing, of invisible service, of unacknowledged care, all condensed into a single, quiet moment of recognition. I didn't mean to wander so far, she said softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. She spoke not to ask for forgiveness, but to break the silence, to reach across the invisible space that had always kept them apart. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped a fraction closer, enough that the distance between them felt charged, yet still proper. The faint rustle of leaves was the only sound, the night itself holding its breath, waiting. Her heart beat unevenly, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. 7 years had taught her caution, had taught her to measure every hope and restrain every desire. And yet, here, under the moonlight, she felt the fragile edges of that restraint begin to fray. She could not name what stirred within her. Was it hope, longing, or something deeper, something forbidden? You have grown stronger, his voice finally came, low and measured, carrying across the mist with the weight of authority, yet softened in a way that only she could perceive. Not a command, not a judgment, simply an observation. And in that small acknowledgement, her chest swelled with an emotion she could not fully name, recognition. She existed, finally, in his eyes, in a way that went beyond shadow or service. She lowered her gaze, shy, uncertain, yet drawn to him nonetheless. I try, she whispered. It felt fragile, inadequate, but it was the truth. She had tried every day, in the quietest ways, to make the world better, to keep herself from breaking. His hand hovered near the hilt of his blade, not in threat, but in vigilance, a silent promise of protection. She could feel the energy radiating from him, subtle yet undeniable, a shield around her that no words could replicate. She had never known such attention, such careful care, and it left her both frightened and strangely elated. For a long stretch, they moved through the clearing together, neither speaking, neither breaking the fragile rhythm that had formed between them. His presence was both comforting and stirring, a mixture of safety and desire she had long believed forbidden. Each step they took, each glance, each silent acknowledgement deepened the bond, weaving a thread that connected them in ways no word could. She dared a small, careful glance at him. The lines of his face, sharp and commanding, softened just enough in the moonlight to reveal something she had never allowed herself to hope for: attention, care, a subtle vulnerability beneath the strength. Her chest tightened at the sight, a mixture of longing and wonder she could scarcely contain. "You," she began, then stopped. Words were inadequate, fragile in the face of what existed between them. How could she describe 7 years of silent yearning, of invisible service, of longing for someone who had never spoken her name? He stepped a fraction closer, enough that she could feel the faintest warmth radiating from him, yet still maintained the distance that both tormented and protected her. It was a slow, deliberate closeness, a dangerous invitation that dared her to hope, dared her to imagine. And she did imagine. She imagined his hand brushing against hers, imagined the unspoken promises behind his gaze, imagined the warmth of his presence merging with her own. She dared not move closer, not yet, but the spark between them pulsed, undeniable, fragile, and intoxicating. The night deepened, and with it, the bond that had begun in silence grew stronger, a thread woven from protection, recognition, and longing. Neither spoke, yet neither felt alone. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of her own heart, and knew that this quiet connection under the moon, was the beginning of something she had never dared name before. Somewhere beyond the clearing, the world continued, indifferent and cruel. Yet here, beneath the watchful moon, she felt seen. She felt chosen, even if only in the most subtle, impossible ways. And that small, fragile certainty, silent, unspoken, yet undeniable, was enough to make her heartbeat quicken, enough to make her wonder what could come next, and whether the bond they shared, delicate as mist and as bright as moonlight, could withstand the dangers yet to come. The sun had barely risen, yet the village square was already alive with whispers, the sound sharp and cutting as knives. She moved through the crowd, her chest tight, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. The gentle rhythm of her days, the fragile peace she had found beneath the Alpha King's watchful eyes, now felt shattered, replaced by a pulse of fear she could not ignore. A courtier stepped forward, his voice loud and accusatory. "You have been seen consorting with outsiders. With strangers. Surely such behavior cannot be tolerated." His eyes flicked to her, cruel and gleaming, as though the years of rejection, of invisibility, had finally prepared her for humiliation too public to endure. Her hands shook, and she instinctively clutched the folds of her dress. 7 years of silence and service had never prepared her for this, the world turning suddenly against her, twisting truth into a weapon. The villagers' murmurs rose like a tide, eager to witness her disgrace, to delight in her misfortune. And yet, through the crowd, she sensed him. The Alpha King, appearing as though summoned by the injustice itself, stepping into the square with the calm authority that had always drawn her attention, yet terrified her heart. His gaze swept across the villagers, sharp and precise, assessing every whisper, every judgment, every sneer. He did not speak immediately. He allowed the courtier's accusations to hang in the damp air, allowed the tension to coil tightly around them, so that the shame and fear she felt were mirrored in the silent anticipation of his judgment. And in that silence, she could feel the depth of his emotion, restrained yet raw, like a storm held behind unyielding walls. Her chest tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to demand truth, but words failed her. 7 years of invisibility had taught her the futility of argument in the face of authority. And yet, now, in the presence of the one person whose opinion mattered most, she felt small and exposed beyond measure. The courtier smirked, mistaking her silence for weakness, and leaned closer. "You cannot hide behind shadows forever. Even the king himself will see that deception cannot last." The Alpha King moved then, deliberately, like a predator stepping into the center of his territory. His voice was calm, low, and impossible to ignore. "Enough." The murmurs ceased instantly. The villagers, the courtier, even the children who had gathered at the edges, all felt the weight of his authority press down like an unspoken command. His eyes, dark and unwavering, met hers for the briefest moment, and she felt both terror and comfort surge within her. He was here. He had seen her, truly seen her, and now he would not allow injustice to touch her. "Do not mistake loyalty for weakness," he said, his tone measured yet deadly. "She has done nothing to warrant your suspicion or scorn. Leave her be." The courtier stumbled back, face pale, and the villagers glanced nervously at each other, the tide of their cruelty breaking under the force of the Alpha King's presence. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words lodged in her throat. She could only stand, trembling, as he stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, a silent declaration that she was under his protection. Her heart pounded not just from fear, but from the undeniable surge of relief, the raw ache of gratitude mingled with something far more dangerous, something she could not yet name, a longing that had been carefully restrained for 7 long years. He did not touch her, did not offer a hand to guide her through the aftermath. Yet his presence was enough, a shield stronger than any word or gesture could ever be. She felt it surrounding her, steady, unyielding, and she realized, with a quiet ache in her chest, that she had begun to rely on it. She had begun to need it. The courtier retreated finally, muttering under his breath, and the villagers slowly dispersed, their whispers fading into uneasy silence. She let out a shivering breath, gripping her hands together to steady herself. Her gaze lifted, and she saw him watching, not just observing, but assessing, as though the moment of betrayal had drawn a line in the air between them. In the quiet aftermath, she felt both exposed and protected, terrified and strangely exhilarated. The betrayal had been public, humiliating, and sharp, but it had also revealed something undeniable: his devotion, his vigilance, and the fact that he could no longer remain distant when the world sought to harm her. Her heart beat fast, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small, dangerous thought. Perhaps the Alpha King had not only seen her in the shadows but had begun to care in ways the world could never understand. And if he cared, truly cared, what might that mean for her? The mist curled through the village streets, soft and silent, and she realized that the thread between them, the invisible bond that had grown over 7 years, had pulled taut. Danger had exposed it, stress had strengthened it, and now it hummed with possibility. She swallowed, trembling, yet unable to hide the flicker of hope rising within her. For the first time, she understood that their connection was no longer merely silent observation. It was something deeper, something alive, something dangerous in its intensity, and it would change everything. The night air was thick with tension, heavy with the scent of rain and earth, as she ran through the winding alleyways of the village. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, and her hands were slick with sweat from clutching the basket she had grabbed in her rush. Every instinct screamed danger, and yet she had nowhere to turn. The courtier's treachery had grown bolder, and whispers of betrayal had shifted into actions she could not ignore. Footsteps echoed behind her, fast, determined, and unrelenting. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic rhythm that threatened to overwhelm her senses. She pressed herself against a wall, trying to steady her breath, trying to remember that she was not completely alone. But the fear gnawed at her, relentless and raw. And then she felt it, the unmistakable presence of the Alpha King. Not distant this time. Close. Immediate. His power radiated through the shadows, a silent force that sent a shiver down her spine. She dared not look back, yet somehow she knew he was there, assessing, calculating, preparing. The danger closed in faster than she could anticipate. A hand grabbed her shoulder, twisting her toward the shadows. Panic flared, but before she could cry out, he was there. In a blur of controlled strength, he intercepted the attacker, his movements precise, devastating, a force of nature contained within a calm, commanding frame. She froze, barely able to comprehend the scene. He did not shout, did not curse, did not draw attention. Instead, he moved like water flowing over stone, deliberate, inevitable, unstoppable. The assailant fell back, stumbling, powerless against the silent authority that radiated from him. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying both command and protection. There was no question in it. She obeyed instantly, relief and fear mingling in her chest. She felt the weight of his presence like armor, wrapping around her, impenetrable, unquestionable. The alley was narrow, the shadows long and deceptive. He guided her with the smallest of gestures, a tilt of his head, a subtle shift of his hand, directing her safely through the labyrinth of danger. Every step was precise, yet gentle. She could feel the intensity in his gaze, the restrained urgency that told her he would not let harm touch her, not now, not ever. A second attacker emerged, silent, swift, but he was already there, moving between her and the threat. She could hear the low hum of his power, the barely perceptible tension in the air as he neutralized danger without a single wasted motion. She pressed close to him, the warmth of his presence seeping into her bones, calming the panic, strengthening the fragile courage within her. They emerged into the open at last, the mist curling around them like smoke. The village lay silent, unaware of the storm that had passed in the narrow streets. She dared to breathe, slowly, deliberately, as he stood before her, his chest steady, his gaze unyielding. "You are safe," he said, and though the words were few, they carried a weight beyond measure. Relief and gratitude surged through her, mingled with something deeper, a realization that she had come to rely on him, not just for protection, but for presence, for care, for recognition in a world that had always ignored her. Her hands trembled as she lowered them, pressing them to her chest, feeling the rapid pulse of her own life. She dared to look at him, and in that moment, The enormity of what he had done struck her fully. He had not merely saved her. He had declared, silently, fiercely, that she mattered. That she was his to protect. The night held its breath as they stood there, connected in a quiet intensity that required no words. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, yet so safe. Every inch of fear she had carried was tempered by the certainty of his guardianship, every doubt softened by the unwavering strength of his presence. And somewhere deep within, a spark ignited, an understanding that their bond, forged in silence and strengthened in danger, had grown into something undeniable. She could not yet name it, could not yet claim it, but she felt it, electric and insistent, threading between them like moonlight through the mist. He did not move closer, not yet. He did not speak of promises or future claims. But she knew, in the quiet resonance of the night, that she was seen, she was protected, and she was chosen in ways the world would never understand. She pressed a hand to her chest, letting the warmth of that certainty settle within her. And though the danger had passed, the tension, the longing, the unspoken promise between them remained, alive, potent, and waiting for the next step. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the walls, warm light spilling into the small chamber and painting everything in gold and amber. Outside, the night was deep and silent, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through the trees. She sat on the edge of the wooden chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, her mind still echoing with the events of the evening. His decisive protection, the fear she had felt, and the tremor of something else, something unspoken, that had passed between them. He stood near the doorway, tall and commanding, yet softened by the firelight that traced the lines of his face. There was a quiet weight in his presence, something both commanding and gentle, and she could feel it settle around her like a cloak. The air between them was thick with tension, not of anger or fear, but of words unsaid, emotions restrained for years now pressing against the surface, demanding recognition. "You," she began, her voice fragile, hesitant, unsure if it would carry across the space that had always felt insurmountable between them. She swallowed, the lump in her throat almost choking her. "You always protect me. Why?" He did not answer immediately. He merely stepped closer, slow and deliberate, the firelight tracing the strength in his movements. And then, finally, his voice came, low, careful, almost hesitant, yet filled with the authority that had always held her heart in check. "Because I cannot stand to see harm touch you," he said, and even in the simplicity of the words, there was depth, years of restraint, of silent observation, of emotions carefully buried beneath duty and control. "Because you are not meant to suffer at the hands of the world. Not you." Her chest tightened at his words. Not meant to suffer. Those words carried more than protection. They carried recognition, attention, a truth she had longed to hear for 7 years. And yet, alongside the warmth, there was fear. 7 years of silence had taught her that the world could be cruel, that attachment could be dangerous, that hope could break hearts. Could she trust him now? Could she allow herself to feel without the safety of distance? She faltered, the weight of her own longing pressing against her lips. "I've waited for someone to see me, to notice me, even a little." The Alpha King's gaze softened, though his stance remained steady, unwavering. He moved another step closer, until the distance between them felt charged, electric, impossible to ignore. "I have seen you," he said, his voice a whisper now, though it carried across the room with undeniable authority. "For 7 years, I have seen you. Every quiet act, every kindness, every moment of courage you thought went unnoticed. I have seen it all." Her hands trembled, and she pressed them to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her own heart, mirrored in the steady, controlled presence of his. "And why? Why did you never?" She stopped, unable to finish, the fear of rejection still wrapped tightly around her words. "Because I could not," he admitted, the restraint in his tone palpable. "Not until now. Not until I could be certain that my presence would not endanger you, that my emotions would not bring harm in ways the world would never forgive. I have restrained myself for your sake, and for mine." She dared to look at him fully, meeting the depth in his eyes, the unspoken admission that had taken years to surface. And in that gaze, she saw everything she had ever hoped for: acknowledgement, care, longing restrained by honor, a desire tempered by vigilance. The silence that followed was profound, a shared breath that carried the weight of their years of longing, of fear, of unspoken truths. She felt the pull of his presence, a gravity that drew her closer even as their circumstances demanded caution. I've never been wanted, she whispered, almost to herself, the words heavy with truth. Not really. Not by anyone, not like this. You are wanted, he said firmly, his voice unwavering, carrying conviction and something deeper, more intimate. By me. Always. Her chest tightened, the weight of years pressing down even as a spark of hope ignited within her. She dared to imagine it, not fully, not yet, but the possibility shimmered like moonlight on water, fragile and beautiful. The distance between them felt unbearable, yet necessary, a tension that held them both in a delicate balance. He stepped closer again, the firelight tracing the sharp lines of his jaw, the strength of his shoulders, the quiet restraint that had always held her heart captive. I will not force you, he whispered. But I cannot hide my truth any longer. You are mine, even when I could not speak it, even when I had to watch from the shadows. You are mine, and I will protect you, in every way I can. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of relief, fear, and longing. The bond between them, forged in silence and strengthened through danger, had finally found its voice. Not in declarations to the world, but in a quiet confession that filled the room, filled the space between them, and filled her heart with something she had never dared to feel before, certainty. And in the hush of the night, amidst the flickering shadows and the warmth of the fire, she understood. For the first time in 7 years, she was seen, truly seen. And the man who had watched from the shadows, who had protected her in silence, who had restrained himself for her sake, he had begun to reveal the depth of his heart, and in that revelation, a fragile, dangerous hope took root. Her breath caught, her pulse raced, and though the night was still, the world felt suddenly alive with possibility. The moon had climbed high, silver and watchful, spilling its light over the quiet village and casting everything in a soft, ethereal glow. She stood at the edge of the clearing, the events of the evening still ringing in her mind, the whispers, the betrayal, the moments of fear that had drawn them together in ways words could not capture. Her heart still thumped, a rapid, uneven rhythm that mirrored the tension she felt in every fiber of her being. And then he was there, as he always was, appearing without sound, a shadow among shadows, yet impossible to ignore. The Alpha King. His presence filled the space around her, commanding and protective, a force that seemed to hold the night itself in its grip. The fire of his gaze met hers, steady, unwavering, yet softened by something she had longed to see for years, unrestrained desire tempered by reverence. You cannot keep pretending, he said, his voice low, resonant, vibrating through the air between them. Not now. Not after everything. Her breath caught, and she pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her fingertips. 7 years of longing, of invisibility, of restraint, every moment led to this. Her pulse raced, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something far more dangerous, hope. He stepped closer, deliberately, with the slow, measured movements that had always held her captive in quiet fascination. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the steady, commanding presence that had guided and protected her through countless moments of danger. And now, that presence pressed closer, an unspoken promise radiating from every line of his body. You are mine, he whispered, and the words were like fire against the cold night, both tender and urgent, reverent and desperate. Not in silence. Not in shadows. You are mine, and I will no longer wait, no longer restrain what I feel. She trembled, caught between shock and relief, between disbelief and longing. Her lips parted, but no words came. All she could do was watch, heart thundering, as he closed the distance between them with a calm intensity that left her breathless. His hands hovered near her shoulders, tentative, reverent, as though touching her could both ignite the world and break it. She felt the weight of his desire, restrained for so long, pressing gently against her own hunger for acknowledgement, for care, for something real after years of denial. Do you understand? He asked, his voice almost a whisper now, yet every syllable carried the weight of authority, of longing, of devotion. You are mine. And I will claim you, here, now, if you will let me. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the edges of the moonlight and the shadows, as her heart swelled with emotion too vast to contain. 7 years of longing, 7 years of waiting, 7 years of being unseen, everything had led to this single, impossible moment. And now, it was here. She nodded, barely audible, a trembling, fragile affirmation. He lowered his hands, letting them rest against her arms with a gentleness that both reassured and ignited, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The night held its breath as he leaned closer, until the warmth of his body brushed against hers, deliberate, reverent, protective. The first contact was soft, electric, a mixture of urgency and reverence, a confirmation of all the unspoken years. She felt the heat of his closeness, the steady power behind every movement, and in that moment, she understood what it meant to be seen, to be chosen, to be claimed in a way that healed as much as it ignited. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, emotions crashing over her in waves, relief, longing, wonder, and the fragile beginnings of love finally allowed to bloom. He did not rush, did not force, but every gentle movement carried the depth of 7 years of restraint, of desire, of care held back only for this moment. She leaned into him, letting herself feel the quiet power of his devotion, the weight of his protection, and the warmth of his claim. The night seemed to stretch around them, holding this first, tender, urgent connection as if the world itself recognized the significance of what had begun. And in the hush of the moonlit clearing, she realized something astonishing. That the Alpha King, so long distant, so long untouchable, was no longer a figure of shadows. He was here, fully present, fully aware, and fully hers. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting pale stripes across the room, but she barely noticed. Sleep had eluded her, her mind still tangled with the events of the previous night. The first claim, the warmth, the reverent urgency that had finally erased 7 long years of longing. Yet beneath the joy and relief, a subtle unease stirred. Something unspoken lingered, a shadow behind the glow of desire and fulfillment. He moved quietly across the room, the Alpha King whose presence had once been distant and untouchable now filled with a weight that both comforted and intimidated her. He had claimed her last night, yes, but there was more to the man behind those commanding eyes, more to the restraint he had exercised all these years, and she sensed the moment of revelation had arrived. He gestured for her to sit, his gaze intense yet careful, and she obeyed, heart still pounding, curiosity mingling with caution. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the sharp lines of his jaw and the shadows beneath his eyes, evidence of burdens he had carried silently, alone, for years. "I need you to understand," he began, voice steady but low, carrying the weight of truth and confession. "What you believe about me, about my distance, about my indifference, it is not what it seemed." She tilted her head, hesitant, sensing the gravity of his words. The silence that followed was profound, charged with tension and anticipation, as though the air itself waited for him to speak. "For 7 years," he continued, "I withheld myself from you not because of a lack of feeling, not because you were unworthy, but because of duty and because of danger." His eyes held hers, unwavering, imploring her to grasp the depth of what he had carried in silence. "There were threats you could not have imagined. Rival packs, political schemes, and enemies of the clan who would have used my affection for you as a weapon against both of us." Her hands clenched in her lap. Every word peeled back layers she had never considered, every explanation reshaping her understanding of his restraint. You kept me at a distance to protect me," she whispered, disbelief and awe mingling in her voice. "Yes," he admitted, a tension in his shoulders betraying the weight of 7 years spent watching, restraining, waiting. "And there were other reasons as well, personal ones. A prophecy. A warning that my desire, unrestrained, could endanger you in ways neither of us could recover from. I had to resist, even when every fiber of my being demanded otherwise." Her chest tightened. A mixture of relief and sorrow washed over her. Relief that his indifference had never been real, sorrow for the years of longing and pain they both had endured, trapped by circumstances and secrets neither could control. I don't know what to say," she admitted, voice trembling. I thought you didn't care." His expression softened, the iron of his authority melting just enough to reveal the vulnerability he had long hidden. "I cared. More than I could ever allow myself to express. Every glance, every small act, every moment I watched you from the shadows, those were my confessions in their own way. I could not act, could not claim you, because the risk was too great. But my heart, he paused, the words caught in the depth of his eyes. My heart has always been yours. Tears pricked her eyes. 7 years of feeling invisible, of being overlooked and disregarded, now collided with the truth she had yearned to hear. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the echo of her own heartbeat, the delicate, dangerous spark of hope and trust building in the space between them. And now? She asked softly, barely audible. Now that the danger is past? Now that you've claimed me? Now, he said, stepping closer, the warmth of his presence radiating toward her. We move forward together. No more shadows, no more silence, no more secrets that keep us apart. You deserve truth, and I will give it to you, all of it, every fear, every burden, every truth I've carried in silence. The vulnerability in his voice, the careful unveiling of years of restraint and danger, made her chest ache with emotion. She realized, fully, that the man who had once seemed untouchable, distant, even cold, had been navigating a labyrinth of threats and duty. Yet still, through it all, he had never stopped caring for her. She reached out, trembling, her fingers brushing the edge of his hand, seeking contact, affirmation, a connection beyond words. He did not resist. Instead, he allowed her the small gesture, a subtle acknowledgement of trust and intimacy, before speaking again. You are mine, he said softly, the words carrying the weight of protection, love, and devotion. And now that the world can no longer harm you without consequence, I will show you every part of me. No restraint. No shadows. Just us, and the bond we share. Her eyes filled with tears, a mixture of gratitude, longing, and burgeoning love. She leaned slightly into him, feeling the solidity of his presence, the reassurance of his claim, and the promise of understanding, protection, and intimacy that went beyond mere words. For the first time, she felt fully seen, fully known, and fully chosen. And in the quiet hush of the room, with the firelight dancing across their faces, the invisible threads of 7 years were finally woven into something tangible, something undeniable, something that could no longer be broken. The sun had just begun its ascent, spilling pale gold over the village square, but the world already seemed to hold its breath. Word had spread quickly, whispers of the Alpha King's intentions, the secret bond he had revealed, and the woman who had, at long last, captured his attention. She moved with measured steps, heart pounding, aware of every glance, every murmur, every judgment that now seemed to press upon her from all sides. And yet, she felt a new weight as well, a warmth, steady and unyielding, that radiated from the Alpha King at her side. His hand brushed hers ever so slightly, not as a touch of casual comfort, but as a signal, a tether anchoring her amidst the rising tide of attention. She dared not look at him fully, afraid of the power in his gaze, yet unable to resist the pull that drew her eyes upward. He was magnificent, tall, commanding, regal even in the simplicity of his attire. Every villager, every courtier, every whispering skeptic fell silent as he stepped into the square, the air around him taut with authority and intent. This was not the distant, observing Alpha of old. This was a man who had claimed what was his, and nothing, not rumor, not ridicule, not opposition, could alter the truth he carried. He stopped at the center of the square, the sun catching the sharp lines of his face, highlighting both the strength and the vulnerability he had revealed in private. His gaze swept over the gathered crowd, slow, deliberate, and unyielding, until it rested on her. And in that look, she felt the full weight of his protection, his devotion, his claim. Every year of rejection, every whispered insult, every shadow she had been forced to inhabit, all of it was swept away in the gravity of that moment. I am the Alpha King of this land, he began, his voice resonant, carrying across the square with the authority of command and the intimacy of confession. And this woman, his eyes never left hers, is mine. Not in whispers, not in shadows, not in secrecy. She stands with me now, as my mate, my partner, my equal in every way that matters. The crowd was stunned. Murmurs rippled like a disturbed pond, some shocked, some resentful, some awestruck. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, yet it no longer intimidated her. With him beside her, she felt something she had never allowed herself before, pride. The low status, the whispers, the years of invisibility, they could no longer touch her, for she had been claimed by the man whose authority and devotion eclipsed them all. A few skeptics stepped forward, their faces tight with disbelief. This is not proper, one said, voice trembling with indignation. You cannot simply declare such a thing. The Alpha King's gaze shifted to them, sharp and unrelenting. I can, he said, calm but final. And I have. She is mine. Anyone who seeks to undermine that truth will answer to me. Consider this your only warning. The air seemed to hum with the intensity of his words. The villagers, courtiers, and onlookers understood immediately. This was not mere declaration. This was power, authority, and love intertwined. She could feel it in her chest, a mixture of relief, exhilaration, and awe. The man who had once remained distant, untouchable, and inscrutable had transformed the world itself with a single, deliberate act. He turned to her, hand brushing hers again, this time with a small, deliberate squeeze that conveyed both reassurance and pride. Do you understand what this means? He asked softly, the public declaration lingering between them like a tangible bond. She nodded, unable to speak at first, caught in the whirlwind of emotion. Fear, relief, longing, and triumph all tangled together. I do, she whispered finally. I'm yours. And you are mine, he replied, voice low, steady, full of reverence. In public, in secret, in every shadow, in every light. No one can take that from us. The crowd remained silent for a long moment, and then, slowly, the reality of the claim settled over them. Some looked on with awe, some with resentment, some with tentative acceptance. But none could deny the truth that now shone as clearly as the morning sun. She had been claimed, protected, and honored by the most powerful alpha in the land. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of it all, the vindication of years spent unseen, the fulfillment of a longing she had almost forgotten, and the solid, undeniable presence of the man who had made her his. For the first time, she understood the full meaning of belonging, of love, of recognition. And as the Alpha King's hand found hers once more, strong and steady, she felt the final whispers of doubt and shame fade like mist in the morning light. The humiliation of the past, the shadows of 7 long years, had been erased, not by words alone, but by truth, authority, and devotion. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze fully, and in that moment, nothing in the world could touch her. She was his. She had been claimed. And together, they would face whatever the future held, stronger, bound, and unstoppable. The village, once bathed in the calm of morning sunlight, now felt charged with an uneasy energy. Rumors of their public claim had spread, but not everyone welcomed it. Shadows lingered where hope had once shone, and dangers that had been distant now crept close enough to touch. She walked beside him, the Alpha King, her hand resting lightly against his arm, feeling the solidity and protection in every step. Yet the weight of uncertainty pressed against her chest. It began subtly, with whispered threats from rival packs, murmurs of betrayal among those who had long envied or scorned her. Then came the tangible dangers, poisoned gifts left at their doorstep, strange movements in the forest at night, and scouts from rival clans appearing where none should have been. Each incident reminded them that their bond, though celebrated by some, had made them targets for others. He never let her walk alone. Each night, he patrolled the perimeter, silent as shadow and swift as wind. When threats came too close, he intervened with the precision and power of a predator who had waited 7 long years for this moment. She watched him in awe, heart swelling with a mixture of fear and admiration, realizing fully the extent of his devotion and the lengths he would go to protect her. And yet, the trials were not only external. Suspicion and mistrust lingered in unexpected places, forcing them to rely on each other in ways that tested the limits of their trust. Small betrayals and hidden agendas threatened to unravel the fragile peace they had claimed. Each whispered lie, each attempted deception was met with his calm vigilance, and with her growing courage to stand by him, to act, and to trust in their bond. One night, as the moon rose full and silver above the forest, danger arrived unannounced. Figures emerged from the shadows, weapons glinting, eyes cold and merciless. She froze, terror gripping her, but he was already there, between her and the threat, a wall of strength and resolve. The fight was swift, a blur of controlled power, and she realized, with awe and fear, how lethal and precise he could be. She wanted to help, to fight, to do something, but he pressed a hand gently to her shoulder, grounding her in the storm. "Stay with me," he commanded softly, voice steady, unwavering. And she obeyed, feeling the gravity of his presence anchor her, giving her courage she hadn't known she possessed. The battle ended almost as quickly as it had begun, their enemies driven back, retreating into the shadows from which they had come. But the adrenaline lingered, mingling with the realization that their connection had been tested under fire, and it had held. Stronger than ever. In the quiet aftermath, as they tended to minor injuries and ensured the village remained safe, their bond deepened in ways that words could not capture. He allowed her close, the protective wall he had maintained for years softening enough to let her see the vulnerability beneath the strength, the fierce devotion behind the calm exterior. "You are more than I ever imagined," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Strong, brave, unwavering, even when fear grips you. You are mine, in every way that matters, and I am yours." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of relief, pride, and a burgeoning love that had been tempered in danger and refined by shared trials. "And I am yours," she whispered, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Through every shadow, every threat, every danger. I am yours." The night stretched on, quiet and intimate, the air still humming with the tension of the day's trials. The moonlight bathed them in silver, and in that serene glow, she realized that their love was no longer fragile or hidden. It had been tested, strengthened, and forged into something unbreakable. Every whispered threat, every shadowy danger, every fear and betrayal had brought them closer, taught them trust, courage, and devotion. And as they stood together, side by side, she knew that whatever trials awaited them in the future, they would face them as one, bound by love, loyalty, and an unbreakable bond that had survived fire, betrayal, and the world itself. The night was still, the kind of stillness that pressed softly against the skin, gentle and all-encompassing. The village lay quiet beneath the silver glow of the full moon, each roof, each street, bathed in pale light. She stood beside him, the Alpha King, her hand resting in his, feeling the steady, unwavering strength that had carried her through danger, betrayal, and years of longing. No words were necessary. None could capture the quiet triumph that stretched between them, the delicate peace that had finally settled in their hearts. They had survived threats, enemies, and the cruel whispers of a world that had once ignored her. They had faced fear, shadow, and uncertainty, and through it all, they had found each other. He turned his gaze toward her, eyes reflecting the moonlight, calm yet full of the devotion she had come to know and rely on. There was a softness in his expression now, a rare vulnerability that he reserved for her alone. "You have no idea," he whispered, voice low and intimate, "how long I have waited for this. How long I have dreamed of this quiet moment, with nothing between us but the night and the moon." Her chest tightened, emotion pressing against her ribcage like a fragile bird struggling to take flight. She had lived through 7 years of invisibility, of being overlooked, of aching for a glance, a word, a touch. And now, finally, here, she felt seen, chosen, and safe, not just in body, but in heart and soul. "I never thought I could feel this," she admitted softly, voice trembling. "So whole. So unafraid. With you." He closed the distance between them, fingers brushing her cheek with reverence, thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. His touch was gentle, deliberate, a promise and a declaration all at once. "You are my heart," he said simply, every word measured, every syllable weighted with truth. "Mine to protect, mine to honor, mine to love, always." Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not of sorrow. They were the soft, luminous tears of relief, of joy, of a longing finally fulfilled. She leaned into him, feeling the steady warmth of his chest, the unyielding strength that had kept her safe, and the quiet intensity of a love that had survived years of restraint and trials. The moonlight bathed them in silver, casting shadows that danced gently across the clearing, yet their own presence seemed untouched by darkness. In the silence, she felt the subtle brush of his fingers against hers, the gentle pull of his hand around her waist, the warmth of his breath mingling with hers. All of it was slow, tender, reverent, a quiet affirmation that their bond, forged in danger and strengthened by trust, was theirs alone. "Forever," she whispered, the word trembling but unwavering. "Forever with you." "Forever," he echoed, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the top of her head, a seal on the years of longing, the trials they had endured, and the life they would now build together. They stood together under the moon, silent and complete, the world around them hushed, bearing witness to the quiet, unshakable truth of their love. No longer broken, no longer overlooked, she had become his chosen, his mate, his equal in a bond tempered by patience, devotion, and courage. And in that silver-lit night, with the soft whisper of the wind through the trees and the gentle pulse of their hearts in tandem, they allowed themselves to simply be. Not rushed, not demanded, not threatened, just present, together, and wholly, entirely, each other's. The scars of the past began to fade in that quiet intimacy. Trust took root where doubt had once lingered. Love, tempered by trials and strengthened through devotion, bloomed fully, filling every shadow, every fear, every silent moment that had come before. And as the moon cast its final glow across the village, she understood a truth she had always longed for. That love, when chosen freely, when protected fiercely, when given and received with patience and devotion, could heal the deepest wounds, conquer the darkest fears, and endure beyond time itself. Under the moonlight, side by side, their hands entwined, hearts aligned, they finally breathed freely. For the first time, she felt whole. For the first time, she knew the meaning of being truly seen, truly claimed, truly loved. And in that quiet, sacred moment, they both knew, whatever storms the world might bring, they would face them together, unshakable, unyielding, and forever bound beneath the moon.